November 25, 1941. Eastern Mediterranean. Early afternoon. The British Mediterranean Fleet is operating south of Crete, maintaining a steady cruising speed of approximately 20 knots, a velocity chosen to balance fuel consumption, formation cohesion, and the assumed threat environment. The fleet doctrine in force treats submarine attack against a maneuvering battleship formation at speed as a low-probability event. This assumption is not ideological. It is mechanical. At 20 knots, a capital ship covers more than 10 meters per second, generating a bow wave, wake turbulence, and propeller cavitation sufficient to degrade passive hydrophone detection inside the escort screen. The doctrine assumes that any submarine attempting approach must either surface, revealing itself, or expend battery capacity at a rate that makes interception and survival unlikely. HMS Barham displaces more than 31,000 tons standard. Her hull length exceeds 210 meters. At cruising speed, her turning circle diameter approaches 800 meters, even with maximum rudder applied. From the moment a submerged contact is detected inside 500 meters, the battleship's minimum time to achieve a meaningful course alteration exceeds 30 seconds. This is not a matter of crew efficiency. It is governed by hydrodynamic inertia and rudder effectiveness at speed. The escort destroyers operate ahead and abeam, spaced to optimize surface and air threat detection rather than close-in anti-submarine geometry. The inner screen is thin by design. Below the surface, U-331, a Type VSE submarine, is operating near the lower boundary of its battery endurance. Submerged speed above 4 knots increases electrical consumption exponentially. At 7 knots, usable endurance collapses to less than 1 hour. At 3 knots, endurance extends beyond 100 hours. The commander has already committed to approach. Battery state is sufficient for a single high-speed maneuvering phase, followed by torpedo launch, but insufficient for prolonged evasion afterward. This constraint defines the entire engagement. There will be no second attempt. At approximately 15:59 local time, U-331 penetrates the British formation undetected. The periscope is raised briefly, for seconds rather than minutes. Visual confirmation replaces sonar. Range is estimated under 400 meters. At this distance, torpedo run time for a G7E electric torpedo, traveling at roughly 30 knots, is under 25 seconds. Arming distance is minimal. Gyro angle adjustment is limited by time. There is no opportunity for iterative refinement. The firing solution is executed immediately, for torpedoes are launched in rapid sequence. The interval between first and last launch is measured in seconds. The submarine's forward momentum, trim, and depth control degrade sharply during the salvo. Electrical load spikes. Control margins narrow. At this point, U-331 has already crossed its own point of no return. Survival now depends entirely on the defender's reaction lag. On the surface, the British fleet receives no actionable warning. Lookouts have no time. Hydrophone data is masked by self-noise. From torpedo water entry to impact, the available response window is shorter than the battleship's minimum maneuver cycle. HMS Barham is struck on the port side. Flooding progresses rapidly. Internal damage control is overwhelmed not by volume alone, but by asymmetry. The list increases. Ammunition handling spaces are compromised. Within minutes, a catastrophic magazine explosion occurs. The ship capsizes and sinks. The sequence from first torpedo impact to loss of the vessel unfolds faster than any external intervention can occur. Escorts cannot reposition in time. Air cover is irrelevant. The outcome is sealed not by surprise, but by temporal compression. Every system involved functions within its design parameters. The failure is systemic. This event immediately challenges the underlying fleet doctrine. The assumption that speed alone provides anti-submarine security is exposed as conditional. Speed reduces detection probability, but it also reduces reaction margin once detection fails. The faster the formation moves, the less time remains to respond inside the inner zone. This trade-off had been acknowledged theoretically. Barham demonstrates it empirically. Subsequent analysis breaks the engagement into discrete intervals. Seconds for periscope exposure, seconds for torpedo run, tens of seconds for helm response, minutes for flooding progression. The critical observation is that the decisive interval is not measured in minutes, but in less than half a minute. Any defensive measure whose activation time exceeds this interval is functionally irrelevant once the submarine reaches firing position. The engagement also reveals the fragility of layered defense when layers are optimized for different threat models. Outer layers assume air reconnaissance and surface interception. Inner layers assume time to maneuver. When a threat bypasses the outer layers and compresses time inside the inner layer, the system collapses abruptly. There's no graceful degradation. For the submarine force, the attack confirms the viability of extreme proximity under specific conditions, but also its unsustainability. U-331 survives only narrowly. The commander orders emergency measures. Control is lost temporarily. The submarine surfaces unintentionally. Only through a combination of depth charges missed and confusion among escorts does the boat escape. The attack consumes nearly all remaining operational margin. It cannot be repeated. From this point forward, the sinking of HMS Barham becomes a reference case, not because it is typical, but because it defines a boundary. It shows precisely how close a submarine must approach, how little time a battleship has to respond, and how narrow the overlap between success and failure truly is. Doctrine begins to adapt around these numbers. Fleet formations are reconsidered. Escort spacing is adjusted to increase inner zone coverage at the cost of outer reach. Speed policies are revised to account for acoustic consequences. Command authority is decentralized to reduce reaction latency. None of these changes eliminate submarine threat. They alter the timing relationship that made Barham possible. At the operational level, planners begin to treat proximity itself as a failure state. Engagements are evaluated not on the basis of firepower exchange, but on whether an attacker can force entry into a zone where time to effect undercuts time to response. If that condition exists, the plan is rejected regardless of other advantages. The Barham loss thus marks a shift from spatial dominance to temporal management. Control of sea space is no longer sufficient. Control of reaction time becomes decisive. Where time collapses, mass and armor are irrelevant. Where time is preserved, even imperfect defenses can recover. This realization extends beyond the Mediterranean. As anti-submarine warfare evolves in the Atlantic, similar principles guide escort doctrine. Early detection is valued not for kill probability, but for time gained. Air patrols are integrated to extend warning depth. The objective is not to destroy every submarine, but to prevent any from reaching the inner zone undetected. The sinking of HMS Barham remains historically significant because it captures the moment when these principles become unavoidable. It is not a story of miscalculation or negligence. It is a demonstration of physical limits intersecting with doctrinal assumptions. Once exposed, those limits cannot be ignored. From that day forward, naval warfare increasingly treats seconds as a strategic resource. Distance, speed, and formation are measured not only in kilometers and knots, but in how much time they preserve before irreversible effect. The Barham engagement stands as a precise illustration of what happens when that resource is exhausted. From this point, the Barham engagement is no longer treated as an isolated wartime loss, but as a calibration event embedded into the logic of fleet operations. Naval staffs begin to formalize what had previously been implicit. The decisive variable is not the presence of submarines, but the minimum time required for a submerged attacker to convert proximity into irreversible damage. Once the time falls below the defender's combined detection, decision, and maneuver cycle, the engagement is already decided. All subsequent actions occur after outcome has been fixed. This understanding reshapes how formations are evaluated before deployment. Speed is no longer assessed solely in relation to transit efficiency or fuel economy. It is assessed against acoustic self-noise thresholds and maneuver latency. At 20 knots, propeller cavitation increases broadband noise sufficiently to mask low-frequency hydrophone returns inside several hundred meters. Reducing speed to 16 knots lowers cavitation intensity and restores partial detection capability, but increases transit time by hours over long distances. The choice becomes explicit. Hours of delay are traded for tens of seconds of warning margin. Doctrine increasingly favors the latter. Escort geometry is adjusted accordingly. Destroyers are repositioned closer to the capital ship, tightening the inner screen at the expense of outer reach. This reduces the probability that a submarine can pass undetected through the final approach zone. The trade-off is quantifiable. A tighter screen reduces coverage area, but increases the likelihood that any penetration will be detected early enough to permit reaction. The objective is not to maximize area denial, but to prevent time collapse. Command procedures are similarly compressed. Standing orders authorize immediate evasive maneuvers on ambiguous indications. The requirement for confirmation is relaxed. A doubtful contact report now triggers action rather than debate. This change removes decision latency measured in seconds. In earlier Doctrine, those seconds were considered acceptable. After Barham, they are not. The engagement also forces a reassessment of battleship survivability assumptions. Armor schemes are designed to resist penetration and contain flooding over time. They are ineffective against asymmetrical damage delivered instantaneously below the waterline. Once a large hull develops rapid list beyond a certain angle, internal counterflooding and damage control become irrelevant. Gravity and fluid dynamics take over. This transition occurs faster than crews can respond. The loss of Barham demonstrates that survivability is not continuous. It is threshold-based. For submarine commanders, the lesson is equally stark. Extreme proximity yields maximum lethality, but consumes all remaining operational margin. The submarine ceases to be a maneuvering platform and becomes a delivery mechanism. Survival afterward is contingent on defender confusion rather than intrinsic capability. As defensive systems mature, reliance on confusion becomes untenable. The window for such attacks narrows further. As a result, submarine doctrine gradually shifts toward engagements that preserve optionality. Longer-range attacks are preferred where torpedo reliability permits. Ambush positions are selected to allow post-launch withdrawal within remaining battery capacity. Where such conditions cannot be met, attacks are deferred. The emphasis moves from singular decisive strikes to sustained attrition. At the strategic level, these adaptations accumulate into a broader transformation. Naval warfare becomes increasingly governed by margin management. Plans are evaluated against worst-case timing scenarios rather than average expectations. Exercises focus on reducing cumulative delays rather than perfecting individual actions. The system is optimized not to perform brilliantly under ideal conditions, but to remain controllable under degraded ones. The Barham case continues to be cited in this context because of its precision. Analysts can assign values to each phase. Seconds for torpedo run, seconds for helm response, minutes for flooding progression. The sequence is deterministic. Given the same initial conditions, the outcome is unavoidable. This removes ambiguity from the lesson. It is not speculative. It is mechanical. As the war progresses, the frequency of such catastrophic single-event losses declines. This is not because submarines become ineffective or battleships invulnerable. It is because the specific timing relationship that makes such losses possible is actively suppressed. Detection is pushed outward. Reaction cycles are shortened. The lethal overlap recedes. Yet the principle exposed by Barham does not disappear. It becomes generalized. Wherever a system allows an adversary to compress execution time below response time, vulnerability persists. The platforms involved may change. The environment may differ. The physics remains constant. In this sense, the sinking of HMS Barham represents a moment of forced clarity. It reveals a structural weakness inherent in complex defensive systems operating near their performance limits. Once revealed, that weakness must be managed continuously. It cannot be eliminated entirely, only avoided. The engagement thus enters naval history not as a dramatic anomaly, but as a boundary condition. It marks the point at which assumptions about endurance and mass give way to a recognition that control in modern warfare is fundamentally temporal. When time collapses, power collapses with it. This recognition drives a final layer of adaptation that operates below the level of explicit doctrine. It reshapes instinct. Commanders begin to feel when margins are thinning, even before instruments confirm it. That intuition is trained, not innate. It is built by repeated exposure to quantified scenarios where seconds are plotted against distance and speed. The Barham engagement supplies one of the earliest and clearest reference curves. Once internalized, it conditions behavior automatically. In practical terms, this means that formations increasingly avoid configurations that appear acceptable on paper but feel temporally brittle in execution. A route that passes close to land, a period without air cover, a night transit at high speed. Each may be defensible in isolation. Combined, they compress warning depth. Experienced commanders learn to recognize these convergences and disperse them in time. Movements are staggered. Speed is adjusted preemptively. The system breathes, maintaining elasticity. The elasticity concept becomes central. A formation with elasticity can absorb a surprise and still recover. One without it fails catastrophically. Elasticity is not a function of strength. It is a function of temporal slack. The Barham sinking demonstrates a system with almost no slack. Once the torpedoes are launched, there is nothing left to stretch. The response curve is already exhausted. This understanding also influences how success is measured in anti-submarine warfare. A submarine forced to break off an approach without being destroyed is still considered a defensive success if it fails to compress time below critical thresholds. The absence of kills is no longer interpreted as failure. Preservation of margin becomes the metric. This shift is subtle but profound. It prioritizes system stability over visible results. For submarines, the corollary is equally constraining. Approaches that rely on pushing a defender into terminal reaction zones become increasingly risky and less frequent. As escorts improve, the probability that any single variable will deviate from expectation rises. A periscope wake glimpsed for 1 second. A sonar return emerging briefly from noise. A destroyer altering course unexpectedly. Any of these disruptions breaks the sequence. The attack collapses. The submarine is left exposed without having delivered effect. This fragility underscores why the Barham case remains analytically clean. The success depends on a near-perfect alignment of variables. That alignment is not repeatable at scale. It can occur, but it cannot be planned reliably. Doctrine evolves to discount such events not because they are impossible, but because they cannot be depended upon. As wartime experience accumulates, this probabilistic understanding hardens. Naval planners accept that some catastrophic outcomes cannot be entirely prevented. What can be prevented is designing systems that make such outcomes likely. Barham illustrates a design that tolerated a narrow but lethal overlap. Subsequent designs aim to close that overlap, even if doing so reduces efficiency elsewhere. This trade-off becomes increasingly explicit in post-1941 operations. Fleets accept slower movement, greater fuel consumption, and reduced geographic reach to preserve temporal depth. These costs are paid continuously to avoid paying the cost Barham represents once. The calculus is rational. A single loss of a capital ship outweighs months of inefficiency. In the longer view, this logic foreshadows the post-war decline of the battleship as the central unit of naval power. It is not air power alone that displaces it. It is the realization that large, slow-reacting systems are inherently vulnerable in environments where execution time can be compressed dramatically. The battleship is not obsolete because it is weak, but because it is slow to respond once certain thresholds are crossed. Barham exposes that vulnerability starkly. Submarines, too, face analogous limits. As detection improves and engagement windows narrow, their ability to deliver decisive effect in a single act declines. They remain dangerous, but their role shifts toward persistence and denial rather than sudden annihilation. Both sides converge toward a model where control is exercised by managing conditions rather than exploiting singular moments. The enduring contribution of the Barham engagement is therefore conceptual. It forces a reevaluation of what it means to control an engagement. Control is no longer the ability to impose will through force. It is the ability to prevent situations where force becomes irrelevant because time has already decided the outcome. This reevaluation resonates far beyond naval warfare. It applies wherever systems interact under tight temporal constraints. Air defense, missile interception, electronic warfare, and later cyber operations all confront similar dynamics. In each case, the decisive factor is not absolute capability, but whether response can occur before effect propagates irreversibly. Barham is an early maritime expression of a universal principle. Seen in this light, the sinking of HMS Barham is neither tragedy nor triumph in isolation. It is a diagnostic event. It reveals how modern systems fail when margins vanish. It shows that failure need not involve incompetence or surprise. It can arise purely from alignment. Once alignment occurs, outcome is fixed. That is why the event continues to matter. It teaches that safety in complex systems is not a static condition, but a continuously managed state. Margins must be preserved deliberately, monitored constantly, and replenished proactively. When they are not, collapse can occur faster than any corrective action. In November 1941, that collapse takes minutes. The lesson extracted from it endures for decades. It shapes how navies move, wait, and decide. It embeds caution into calculation, and it ensures that the most important battles are those in which timing never collapses, because the conditions that would allow collapse have been engineered out long before the first torpedo could ever be launched. From this perspective, the Barham engagement becomes a fixed point against which later technological progress is measured. Every improvement in sensors, communications, propulsion, and command systems is evaluated not only for its absolute capability, but for how it shifts the balance between execution time and response time. When a new system reduces detection latency by 5 seconds, its value is immediately intelligible. When a new procedure shortens decision cycles by 10 seconds, its strategic relevance is clear. These gains are not abstract. They are measured directly against the margins exposed in 1941. This measurement discipline alters how innovation is prioritized. Technologies that promise greater lethality without improving tempo control are viewed skeptically. By contrast, modest improvements that extend warning depth or reduce reaction lag receive disproportionate attention. A sensor that detects reliably 300 meters farther out is valuable not because of the distance itself, but because it converts that distance into 15 to 20 additional seconds of decision space at typical approach speeds. That conversion is what matters. The same logic governs training. Crews rehearse not just actions, but timing. Drills are evaluated by stopwatch, from alarm to rudder over, from contact report to maneuver initiation. Each interval is recorded. Variability is reduced. The objective is not perfection, but predictability. When response times are predictable, planners can design systems that remain controllable even under stress. Barham demonstrates the danger of relying on average performance rather than worst-case timing. At the fleet level, this emphasis on predictability reshapes coordination. Formations are simplified to reduce synchronization demands. Communication protocols are standardized to minimize ambiguity. Orders are phrased to trigger predefined actions rather than discretionary interpretation. Each simplification removes potential delay. The cumulative effect is a system that reacts faster not because individuals are more capable, but because fewer steps intervene between perception and action. For submarines, predictability becomes a liability rather than an asset. Defensive systems increasingly anticipate standard approach patterns and firing geometries. Submarines that adhere rigidly to doctrine are detected earlier. This forces attackers to improvise, but improvisation under severe time constraints increases error probability. The tension between predictability and flexibility becomes acute. Barham sits at the point where the attacker's predictability aligns perfectly with the defender's blind spot. That alignment becomes increasingly difficult to achieve as defenses adapt. As the war continues, the accumulation of small temporal advantages on the defensive side produces a qualitative shift. Attacks that once seemed possible become impractical. Theoretical feasibility remains, but operational feasibility vanishes. This distinction is critical. It explains why certain tactics persist in manuals long after they cease to appear in combat reports. Barham is remembered not because it validates a tactic indefinitely, but because it defines the last conditions under which that tactic works reliably. At the strategic scale, this process contributes to a broader dampening of shock. Warfare becomes less prone to sudden, decisive reversals caused by isolated events. Outcomes are determined by sustained pressure, attrition, and systemic advantage, rather than by single moments of collapse. This does not make war safer or less destructive. It makes it more controlled. The system absorbs violence over time, rather than releasing it explosively. The Barham sinking thus occupies a transitional position. It belongs to a phase when systems are powerful enough to destroy instantly, but not yet integrated enough to prevent instantaneous destruction. Once integration catches up, such events become rarer. They do not disappear entirely, but they cease to dominate strategic outcomes. This transition has psychological consequences as well. The expectation of sudden catastrophe diminishes. Commanders become accustomed to managing risk through structure rather than daring. The culture shifts subtly away from heroic exploitation toward disciplined margin preservation. This is not a loss of aggressiveness, but a redefinition of what effective aggression looks like under modern conditions. In retrospect, the significance of HMS Barham lies less in its destruction than in the clarity it provides about how complex systems fail. The engagement strips away extraneous factors and exposes a simple relationship. When execution outruns response, control collapses. Everything else, armor, numbers, training, becomes secondary. This relationship is neither moral nor political. It is mechanical. As long as military systems continue to accelerate, this relationship will recur. New domains will experience their own Barham moments, where margins are revealed to be thinner than assumed. The historical value of the 1941 engagement is that it offers an early, unambiguous example. It allows later generations to recognize the pattern before paying the same price. In this way, the event achieves a form of permanence. It no longer belongs solely to naval history. It becomes part of the general grammar of modern conflict. It teaches that dominance is provisional, that safety is conditional, and that time, once lost, cannot be reclaimed within the same engagement. The sinking itself occupies only a few minutes. The analytical consequences extend far beyond. They shape how forces are designed, how they move, and how they decide not to move. They encourage restraint grounded in calculation rather than fear, and they ensure that the most decisive victories are those that never announce themselves, because the seconds that would have decided them were never allowed to slip away. By the final phase of this adaptation, the Barham engagement no longer needs to be cited explicitly to influence behavior. Its logic is embedded in constraints that govern movement automatically. Fleet schedules avoid windows where reaction margin would fall below defined thresholds. Patrol patterns are arranged so that no capital ship transits without overlapping coverage capable of extending warning time by at least one full maneuver cycle. These constraints operate continuously, shaping outcomes before contact ever occurs. This embedding alters how failure is perceived. When later losses occur, they are examined not as repetitions of Barham, but as deviations from the safeguards designed to prevent it. Investigations focus on where temporal buffers eroded unnoticed. Was air coverage delayed by minutes? Was escort spacing widened to maintain speed? Was acoustic performance degraded by sea state? Each question traces back to the same axis. How much time was available and where it was consumed? At the material level, ship design evolves to reflect this priority. Control systems are optimized for faster response rather than greater authority. Rudder actuators are improved to reduce lag. Internal communications are streamlined to eliminate unnecessary relay steps. Alarm systems are configured to trigger predefined maneuvers automatically when certain conditions are met. These changes do not make ships invulnerable. They reduce the probability that a threat can compress time below recoverable limits. The same logic influences the distribution of forces. Capital ships increasingly operate within protective envelopes defined by air range and escort density. When those envelopes cannot be guaranteed, operations are delayed or restructured. This restraint is not strategic hesitation. It is risk management informed by empirical boundary cases. Barham demonstrates the cost of operating outside such envelopes when assumptions about reaction time prove false. For submarine operations, the maturation of defenses reinforces the shift away from singular, high-risk engagements. Boats that attempt to recreate Barham-like conditions encounter increasingly hostile environments. Detection occurs earlier. Escorts maneuver preemptively. Reaction cycles are shorter. The narrow overlap that once allowed decisive proximity shrinks further. Submarines that survive and remain effective are those that avoid forcing engagements into terminal zones. Persistence replaces proximity as the primary currency. This mutual adjustment produces a more stable equilibrium. Attacks still occur. Losses still happen. But the probability of instantaneous, uncontestable collapse declines. Warfare becomes a contest of endurance and adaptation rather than of singular moments. The Barham sinking stands out precisely because it occurs before this equilibrium is established, when systems are powerful enough to destroy quickly, but not yet disciplined enough to prevent rapid destruction. Historically, this moment coincides with a broader transformation in military thinking. Industrial-scale warfare forces organizations to confront the limits of human-centered control under extreme time pressure. Barham exposes those limits in a maritime context with unusual clarity. The lesson is not confined to the sea. It resonates wherever decision cycles approach the speed of effect. As technology continues to accelerate, the risk of similar collapses reemerges in new forms. Faster weapons reduce execution time. Automated systems reduce response time, but introduce new dependencies. The balance remains delicate. The underlying equation does not change. Control depends on maintaining sufficient margin between perception and effect. When that margin disappears, outcome is immediate. The enduring relevance of the Barham engagement lies in its simplicity. It requires no exotic explanation. It does not hinge on rare technology or extraordinary error. It is the product of ordinary systems interacting at their limits. That is what makes it instructive. Ordinary systems fail not gradually, but abruptly when margins vanish. In strategic memory, such events serve as anchors. They define what must be avoided rather than what must be achieved. They constrain imagination, but in doing so, they preserve control. The Barham sinking becomes one such anchor. It fixes a line beyond which planners are unwilling to go. Ultimately, the engagement significance is measured not by how often it is referenced, but by how rarely its conditions recur. Its success as a lesson is proportional to its absence from later combat reports. Where its logic is respected, nothing dramatic happens. Where it is ignored, collapse remains possible. In November 1941, the collapse is total and irreversible. The ship sinks. The lesson spreads. From that point forward, naval warfare increasingly treats time as the most perishable resource. Distance, speed, and power are valued only insofar as they preserve it. When time is preserved, systems remain controllable. When it is lost, control ends faster than any corrective action can be applied. That reality, revealed with stark clarity in the loss of HMS Barham, continues to govern modern conflict. It ensures that the most decisive factor is often invisible, measured not in tons or guns, but in the seconds that separate awareness from effect. At the far end of this evolution, the Barham engagement effectively disappears as an operational possibility, yet remains present as a limiting case. It functions as a negative space in planning, an outcome that defines what must not be allowed to form. This absence is deliberate. It reflects a mature system that has internalized the cost of temporal collapse and reorganized itself to prevent it silently. Naval operations increasingly resemble controlled processes rather than confrontations. Movement is phased. Exposure is segmented. High-risk transits are synchronized with maximum coverage. The system is engineered so that no single failure consumes all available margin at once. This engineering is not centralized. It is distributed across procedures, technologies, and habits. Each element contributes a few seconds. Together, they restore minutes. The Barham case also sharpens understanding of irreversibility. Once certain physical thresholds are crossed, flooding rate exceeding pump capacity, list angle exceeding recovery limits, internal explosions propagating through compromised compartments, control cannot be regained. These thresholds are reached quickly when damage is asymmetrical and sudden. The engagement shows that prevention must occur before these thresholds are approached. Afterward, action is symbolic. This recognition feeds into the broader decline of surface units whose survivability depends on time-intensive damage control. Systems that require minutes to stabilize are increasingly vulnerable in environments where effect is delivered in seconds. The battleship embodies this vulnerability. Its strengths, mass, compartmentalization, redundancy, are optimized for protracted engagements. Barham demonstrates how those strengths become irrelevant when the engagement collapses into an instant. Submarines, conversely, confront the opposite problem. Their effectiveness peaks when they can deliver effect without being forced into prolonged exposure. As defenses improve, opportunities for such delivery diminish. The role of the submarine evolves accordingly. It becomes less a weapon of singular annihilation and more a persistent disruptor. Its value lies in forcing the defender to spend time and resources maintaining margin, even when no attack occurs. This mutual evolution produces a form of strategic friction. Neither side can easily force decisive collapse without first eroding the other's temporal buffers. The war becomes a contest of buffer management rather than of decisive blows. The Barham sinking stands out because it occurs before this friction dominates. at a moment when buffers are thin and assumptions are still untested. From a systems perspective, the engagement illustrates how complex organizations learn. They do not learn from averages. They learn from extremes. Barham is an extreme case where multiple small delays align catastrophically. Its impact lies in forcing recognition that acceptable delays can accumulate into unacceptable outcomes. Once recognized, those delays are targeted systematically. This process is incremental. A few seconds removed here, a few seconds gained there. No single change appears transformative. Yet over time, the cumulative effect is decisive. The same engagement geometry no longer produces the same outcome. The system has moved. The boundary has shifted. Historically, this shift contributes to the broader stabilization of naval warfare in the later years of the conflict. While losses remain severe, they occur within a framework that absorbs them without sudden collapse. The shock value of single events diminishes. Control becomes more resilient, not because threats are weaker, but because margins are wider. The enduring lesson of HMS Barham lies precisely here. It shows that resilience is not inherent. It is constructed. It must be maintained continuously, and it can be lost quietly if assumptions go unchallenged. The ship sinks not because it is obsolete, but because the system around it tolerates a narrow margin that proves fatal. In the end, the engagement defines a principle that outlives the war. Modern conflict is governed less by the ability to strike than by the ability to prevent strikes from becoming decisive. That prevention is temporal at its core. It depends on preserving enough time to respond before effect becomes irreversible. The Barham sinking captures the moment when that time is lost completely. It does so with unusual clarity, leaving no ambiguity about cause or consequence. That clarity is what gives the event its lasting analytical power. It reminds planners that control is not a static attribute, but a dynamic condition sustained only as long as time remains available. As long as weapons can act faster than humans can react, this condition will remain precarious. Systems will continue to operate near their limits. New Barham-like boundaries will emerge in different domains. The value of the 1941 engagement is that it provides an early, concrete example of how such boundaries form and what happens when they are crossed. Thus, the story concludes not with resolution, but with incorporation. HMS Barham disappears beneath the surface. Its lesson rises into doctrine. From that point forward, the most important battles are fought invisibly, in the preservation of margins that ensure collapse never occurs. Where those margins hold, nothing dramatic happens. Where they fail, the outcome is decided before anyone has time to intervene. From here, the logic completes its transition from historical case to structural constraint. The Barham engagement no longer informs decisions by analogy. It informs them by exclusion. Any configuration that allows an attacker to compress execution time below the defender's minimum response envelope is treated as invalid before contact is even considered. This exclusion operates quietly, embedded in route planning, escort allocation, and speed regulation. At this stage, time is treated explicitly as a consumable resource. Every maneuver expends it. Every sensor ambiguity consumes it. Every unnecessary command loop wastes it. Planning therefore aims to conserve time the way fuel or ammunition is conserved. When time reserves fall below a defined minimum, operations pause or reroute. This behavior appears conservative only if the cost of time collapse is ignored. Barham defines that cost unambiguously. The engagement also clarifies that time loss is rarely dramatic in isolation. It accumulates through small, tolerated delays. A few seconds of hesitation, a few seconds of signal relay, a few seconds of mechanical lag. Each delay is individually acceptable. Together, they erase margin. The Barham sinking demonstrates how these increments align. No single delay is decisive. There some is. This understanding reshapes how readiness is measured. Instead of asking whether a unit can respond, planners ask how fast it responds under degraded conditions. Exercises deliberately introduce noise, ambiguity, and partial failure to observe how quickly margin erodes. The objective is not to eliminate failure, but to ensure that failure consumes time slowly enough to permit recovery. Barham represents the opposite condition, where failure consumes all remaining time at once. As systems mature, they become increasingly intolerant of narrow margins. Procedures that once relied on human judgment are replaced by pre-authorized actions. Thresholds are defined numerically. If estimated time to effect drops below a fixed value, withdrawal is mandatory. There is no debate. The rule exists precisely to prevent debate from consuming the last available seconds. For submarine forces, the parallel rule emerges inversely. Attacks that require complete expenditure of margin are reclassified as exceptional rather than routine. They are undertaken only when strategic value justifies near certain loss. In most cases, such justification does not exist. Submarines that remain effective are those that preserve the ability to disengage. Persistence outweighs spectacle. This convergence produces a stable but constrained battle space. Neither side seeks to force decisive collapse unless conditions are overwhelmingly favorable. The war shifts toward management of risk rather than pursuit of dramatic effect. This does not reduce lethality overall. It redistributes it over time. Losses continue, but they are absorbed incrementally rather than catastrophically. Historically, this shift contributes to the decline of single-event determinism in naval warfare. Outcomes are no longer decided by isolated encounters alone. They are shaped by sustained pressure, attrition, and the gradual erosion of margins. Barham remains significant precisely because it occurs before this shift is complete, when systems still tolerate lethal compression without recognizing it. The analytical clarity of the event ensures its persistence in professional thought. It provides a clean demonstration of how complex systems fail when operating too close to their limits. There is no mystery in the outcome once parameters are set. Distance converts to time. Speed compresses intervals. Energy limits endurance. Human reaction introduces delay. When these variables align unfavorably, collapse follows. As long as these variables remain fundamental to warfare, similar boundaries will exist. Technology can shift them. Doctrine can manage them. They cannot be eliminated. New systems will create new Barham-like points, where assumptions about margin are tested and sometimes disproven. The value of the 1941 engagement is that it offers an early, unambiguous example of this process. In its final form, the lesson is austere. Control is not guaranteed by strength alone. It is sustained only while time remains available to act. Once time collapses below the threshold required for response, control ends immediately. No correction is possible within the same engagement. Prevention must occur earlier, upstream, before proximity becomes terminal. That is why the Barham sinking endures an analysis long after its tactical details fade. It fixes attention on the only variable that cannot be replenished once lost. It shows that in modern war, the decisive moment is often invisible, measured not in fire or movement, but in the seconds quietly consumed before anyone realizes they are gone. At the final depth of this analysis, the Barham engagement resolves into a constraint that governs not only naval operations, but the logic of modern force employment as a whole. Once time is recognized as the decisive medium, strategy itself becomes an exercise in delaying commitment until sufficient margin is guaranteed. Commitment without margin is redefined as failure in advance. The loss of HMS Barham illustrates this principle with mechanical precision. From a planning perspective, this leads to the institutionalization of conservative thresholds. These thresholds are not expressions of caution in the psychological sense. They are expressions of physics. If a ship's minimum maneuver cycle is 30 seconds and an attacker's time to effect inside a given radius is 25 seconds, that radius is forbidden space. No amount of training or confidence can alter that relationship. The boundary is absolute. As a result, operational art shifts toward shaping the environment so that forbidden spaces never overlap with mission-critical movement. Routes are extended. Speeds are modulated. Patrol coverage is layered. Each adjustment increases separation between perception and effect. The system is designed to fail slowly rather than abruptly. Slow failure preserves agency. Abrupt failure eliminates it. This philosophy becomes embedded in command culture. Decision-making favors reversibility. Actions that cannot be undone within available time are scrutinized more heavily. The preference is not for boldness, but for controllability. Barham demonstrates the cost of irreversibility. Once the torpedoes strike, no subsequent decision matters. The engagement is over before command can reassert itself. For submarines, the mirror image holds. Attacks that expend all remaining margin in a single act are recognized as inherently terminal. They deliver effect, but at the cost of future agency. As defenses mature, the strategic value of such attacks declines. Submarines that remain influential are those that preserve the ability to choose when not to attack. The denial of enemy freedom of movement becomes as important as the destruction of individual units. At the level of war, this mutual restraint produces a more stable, but no less violent conflict. Power is exercised through sustained pressure rather than sudden annihilation. Control is maintained by preventing thresholds from being crossed rather than by reacting once they are. The Barham sinking stands out because it occurs at a moment when this restraint is not yet fully developed, and the system permits a lethal overlap to form. The enduring analytical value of the event lies in its clarity. There is no ambiguity about cause. No hidden factor alters the outcome. The relationship between time, distance, speed, and response is sufficient to explain everything that follows. This clarity strips the event of narrative romance. It becomes a diagram rather than a story. That diagram remains relevant because the variables it depicts are invariant. Technology can accelerate or decelerate them. Doctrine can manage them. They cannot be abolished. Wherever forces operate near their limits, similar diagrams exist, waiting to be realized if margins erode unnoticed. In this sense, the sinking of HMS Barham is not merely a historical episode. It is a permanent warning encoded in numbers. It reminds planners that strength without time is meaningless, that protection without margin is illusory, and that control, once lost to temporal collapse, cannot be recovered within the same engagement. The ship sinks in minutes. The lesson persists for decades. It persists not because it is dramatic, but because it is exact. It shows that modern war punishes delay without mercy, and that the only reliable defense against such punishment is to ensure that delay never becomes decisive. Thus, the narrative closes where it began, not with the image of an exploding battleship, but with the recognition of a boundary. On one side lies controllable conflict, where decisions still matter. On the other lies instantaneous collapse, where outcomes precede intent. The line between them is thin, measured in seconds, and invisible until crossed. HMS Barham crosses it once. Naval doctrine spends the rest of the war ensuring that it is never crossed again. Beyond that boundary, nothing remains to be adjusted tactically. What follows is institutional memory hardening into constraint. The Barham engagement is absorbed into planning not as a warning to be remembered, but as a condition to be engineered out. The absence of similar losses in later phases of the war is not accidental. It is the measurable effect of a system that has learned where it cannot afford to operate. At the level of fleet scheduling, this learning translates into temporal separation between exposure and vulnerability. Capital ships are no longer permitted to transit contested waters during periods when escort density or air coverage cannot guarantee a minimum reaction margin. These margins are calculated explicitly. If expected warning depth falls below the duration of one full maneuver cycle plus decision latency, the transit is delayed. The delay is accepted as cost. The alternative is defined as unacceptable risk. This discipline reshapes logistics. Fuel consumption increases as routes lengthen. Maintenance cycles are disrupted as ships wait for favorable conditions. Operational tempo slows. Yet these inefficiencies are tolerated because they preserve controllability. The Barham case demonstrates that efficiency gained at the expense of margin produces catastrophic loss, rather than incremental advantage. Once that trade-off is understood, it is no longer debated. The same principle governs how escorts are tasked. Destroyers are assigned not to maximize offensive reach, but to maintain continuous coverage inside the critical inner zone. Their patrol patterns are evaluated by how evenly they distribute reaction time, rather than by how aggressively they pursue contacts. An escort that never engages, but prevents time collapse, is considered successful. This represents a fundamental inversion of earlier metrics. From the submarine perspective, the inverse inversion occurs. Success is no longer measured by proximity achieved, but by the freedom retained after contact. Submarines that approach too closely without escape margin are reclassified as expended assets regardless of outcome. This classification reflects a systemic view of effectiveness rather than a tactical one. The war is no longer fought engagement by engagement, but through preservation and erosion of operational capacity over time. The Barham sinking provides a clean demonstration of why this shift is necessary. U-331 U-331 succeeds tactically, but nearly annihilates itself operationally. The exchange is asymmetrical in immediate effect, but symmetric in cost when viewed over time. As defenses mature, such exchanges become strategically irrational. The system learns to avoid them on both sides. This mutual avoidance produces a war that is less spectacular, but more controlled. The absence of dramatic single-ship catastrophes does not indicate reduced danger. It indicates that danger is being managed upstream. The decisive work occurs in planning rooms, training schedules, and procedural refinements that shave seconds from response and add seconds to warning. In this environment, the Barham engagement continues to function as a calibration curve. When planners assess a new configuration, they implicitly compare it to the 1941 conditions. Does this configuration allow a submerged attacker to convert proximity into effect faster than response can occur? If yes, the configuration is rejected. If no, it is considered viable. The process is mechanical, not interpretive. As warfare continues to evolve, this mode of thinking becomes increasingly dominant. New technologies are evaluated primarily by how they affect timing relationships. Faster weapons are dangerous not because of their power, but because of the response they preclude. Defensive systems are valuable not because they are impenetrable, but because they restore time. The enduring significance of HMS Barham lies precisely here. It marks the point at which time becomes the explicit currency of control. Before it, time is implicit, assumed to be available. After it, time is treated as scarce and perishable. The shift is irreversible. In historical hindsight, the event appears almost inevitable. All the components are in place. High speed, thin inner screen, limited air coverage, a submarine willing to expend all remaining margin. What is missing is not awareness, but recognition of how little time remains once awareness is achieved. That recognition comes only after the fact. From that moment on, naval warfare proceeds under a new constraint. Awareness without time is meaningless. Action without margin is futile. Control exists only while the gap between perception and effect remains open. When it closes, outcome is fixed. That is the final structural lesson of the Barham sinking. It is not about bravery or error. It is about the unforgiving nature of temporal thresholds in complex systems. Once crossed, they do not bend. They do not forgive. They simply decide. And because they decide so quickly, the only rational response is to ensure they are never reached. At this terminal depth, the engagement resolves into a rule set that governs behavior, even when the historical details have faded. The rule is simple in expression and severe in implication. No system may rely on reaction once execution time falls below response time. That rule becomes embedded not as doctrine to be cited, but as architecture to be enforced. Architecturally, fleets are organized to ensure that execution time for any plausible attacker remains longer than the slowest permissible response. This is achieved not by perfecting response, but by degrading execution opportunities. Approach paths are obstructed. Detection is layered so that even partial cues arrive early enough to force attackers to commit energy before proximity is achieved. Each forced commitment drains battery, reveals intent, or alters geometry. The attacker's execution clock is pushed outward in time. The Barham engagement illustrates the opposite condition. U-331 reaches a position where execution is cheap and response is expensive. The submarine expends seconds. The battleship would need minutes. That asymmetry is decisive. The modern response is to reverse it. Make execution expensive and response cheap. When this inversion is achieved, the same proximity that once guaranteed success becomes suicidal. This inversion reshapes the meaning of deterrence at sea. Deterrence no longer depends on the certainty of destruction, but on the certainty of failure to achieve effect. A submarine commander who knows that any close approach will be detected early enough to force abort will not attempt it. The weapon does not need to fire to be effective. The system denies opportunity rather than punishing action. At scale, this denial alters operational tempo. Submarine forces impose caution without contact. Surface forces proceed slowly but securely. The conflict becomes one of imposed delays rather than sudden losses. The Barham sinking stands as a counterexample, a moment when denial fails and punishment arrives instantly. That contrast defines subsequent practice. The engagement also clarifies the relationship between mass and agility. Large systems carry inertia that cannot be overcome within short intervals. Small systems can exploit that inertia only if they can enter the terminal zone undetected. Once detection is extended even modestly, inertia becomes an advantage again, allowing large systems to maneuver gradually while small systems exhaust themselves attempting approach. The balance hinges entirely on when detection occurs. This timing sensitivity reinforces why average performance metrics are misleading. Average detection ranges, average reaction times, average speeds. None of these matter at the boundary. What matters is worst-case alignment. Barham occurs at the worst case. Subsequent systems are designed to ensure that worst-case conditions are survivable, even if average performance remains unchanged. From a historical standpoint, this shift contributes to a gradual disappearance of decisive single-ship losses from surface action reports. Ships are still damaged. Ships are still sunk, but they are rarely lost without prolonged engagement. When they are, the cause is traced to failures in margin preservation rather than to enemy brilliance. The analytical language changes accordingly. The endurance of the Barham lesson lies in its resistance to reinterpretation. It does not depend on motive, doctrine, or technology. It depends on arithmetic. Given a set of distances, speeds, and response times, the outcome can be predicted with precision. That predictability strips the event of ambiguity. It leaves no room for comforting narratives. As new domains emerge, missile warfare, electronic attack, autonomous systems, the same arithmetic reappears. Execution times shrink. Response times struggle to keep pace. Systems again approach boundaries where control can collapse instantaneously. In each case, the question becomes familiar. Where is the Barham point? Where does the system fail cleanly and irreversibly if margins erode? The value of the 1941 engagement is that it provides a concrete answer to that question in one domain. It shows that such points are real, that they can be crossed unintentionally, and that once crossed, recovery is impossible within the same event. That knowledge is transferable. It informs how planners think about speed, automation, and delegation long after the original context is gone. In its final abstraction, the sinking of HMS Barham is no longer about a submarine or a battleship. It is about the relationship between time and control. It demonstrates that control is not something possessed. It is something maintained moment by moment through the preservation of margin. When margin collapses, control vanishes with it. The ship sinks quickly because margin collapses completely. The lesson persists because it generalizes perfectly. As long as systems interact at high speed under uncertainty, similar collapses remain possible. The only defense is to recognize where they can occur and to design systems that never allow conditions to align. That recognition marks the true end of the narrative. Not closure, but constraint. The Barham engagement ceases to be a story told. It becomes a boundary obeyed. And in obeying it, navies ensure that the most decisive moments of modern warfare remain those that never occur, because the seconds that would have decided them are preserved long before anyone realizes they might be needed. At the absolute terminus of this logic, the Barham engagement ceases even to function as a lesson and becomes a silent invariant. It defines a region of the operational space that is simply excluded from consideration. Planners do not debate it. Commanders do not argue against it. The system behaves as if that region does not exist because entry into it produces outcomes that cannot be managed. This exclusion has a measurable effect on how naval power is projected. Operations that once would have been executed at the edge of tolerance are restructured to remain comfortably inside controllable envelopes. Exposure is segmented. High-speed transits are bracketed by extended reconnaissance. Periods of vulnerability are shortened or eliminated entirely. The system trades immediacy for assurance. The trade is justified not by caution, but by the mathematics of irreversible collapse. At this point, time is no longer treated as an operational variable among others. It becomes the governing variable. Distance, speed, formation, and even mission priority are evaluated through its lens. If a task cannot be executed while preserving sufficient temporal margin, it is postponed, reconfigured, or abandoned. This discipline does not weaken force employment. It prevents force from being expended in ways that cannot be corrected once initiated. The Barham sinking illustrates what happens when such discipline is absent. The fleet operates inside a narrow margin without recognizing how little slack remains. The submarine exploits that slack completely. The result is not a contest, but a terminal sequence. From the moment the torpedoes are launched, no decision taken by the defender can alter the outcome. Control has already ended. Modern systems are designed to ensure that this moment never arrives unnoticed. Warning is extended outward. Decision cycles are shortened inward. Authority is pushed closer to sensors. Automation absorbs predictable delays. Each measure exists to preserve the gap between awareness and effect. The gap does not need to be large. It needs only to be larger than the attacker's execution chain. The enduring insight is stark. When that gap exists, even imperfect defenses can recover. When it does not, even perfect defenses are irrelevant. This binary condition is what makes the Barham case analytically pure. There is no partial failure. There is no gradual degradation. There is only margin, and the sudden absence of margin. As warfare evolves, the specific form of execution changes. Torpedoes give way to missiles. Periscopes give way to sensors. Batteries give way to reactors. Yet the relationship remains unchanged. Execution still consumes time. Response still requires time. When execution outruns response, control collapses immediately. In this final abstraction, the sinking of HMS Barham becomes a reference point not for naval history alone, but for any domain in which complex systems operate near their limits. It shows that safety is not a function of strength, but of spacing and time. It shows that failure does not require incompetence or surprise. It requires only alignment. That is why the event endures in professional thought. It is not dramatic in its explanation. It is unforgiving in its implications. It teaches that margins must be defended as aggressively as territory, because once margins are lost, territory follows automatically. The narrative, therefore, does not end with the wreck settling on the seabed. It ends with a rule imposed on future action. A rule that says, do not allow execution to become cheaper than response. Do not allow proximity to become terminal. Do not allow time to collapse unnoticed. Everything that follows in naval doctrine, and later in joint and combined warfare, flows from this constraint. It is obeyed not because it is remembered, but because it has been internalized. Where it is obeyed, catastrophe is avoided quietly. Where it is ignored, collapse remains as sudden and absolute as it was on November 25, 1941. That is the final scale of the Barham engagement. Not an episode, not a warning, but a boundary condition that defines the difference between controllable conflict and instantaneous loss. Beyond that boundary, nothing meaningful remains to be optimized at the level of individual platforms. What persists is governance of interaction itself. The Barham engagement hardens into a systemic prohibition. Never permit a configuration in which an adversary's minimum execution chain is shorter than the slowest defensible response chain. This prohibition is enforced indirectly, through geometry, timing, and procedure, rather than through constant vigilance or heroic intervention. In practice, this means that operational plans increasingly incorporate deliberate slack. Slack is not waste. It is stored controllability. A patrol that appears redundant exists to preserve margin when another layer degrades. A speed reduction that seems inefficient exists to restore acoustic clarity and reaction time. A delayed transit exists to ensure overlap with air coverage. Each measure appears modest. Together, they prevent alignment. The Barham case also clarifies that alignment is the true enemy. No single factor is decisive on its own. Speed alone does not sink a battleship. Proximity alone does not guarantee success. Surprise alone does not decide outcomes. Collapse occurs only when multiple tolerable conditions coincide within a narrow temporal window. The rarity of that coincidence after 1941 is not accidental. It is the result of deliberate decorrelation. Systems are arranged so that vulnerabilities do not peak simultaneously. This decorrelation becomes a design principle. Capabilities that peak together are separated in time or space. High-speed movement is avoided when detection is weak. Reduced escort density is avoided when air cover is intermittent. Maintenance cycles are scheduled to avoid coinciding with high-risk transits. The aim is not perfection, but staggering. If weaknesses do not overlap, collapse cannot occur. For submarine forces, the same principle imposes restraint. The alignment required for a Barham-like success becomes increasingly improbable. Battery state, approach geometry, target speed, escort spacing, and detection conditions must all align within seconds. As defenses mature, at least one variable deviates early. The sequence breaks. The attack is aborted or fails. The submarine preserves itself by disengaging. Effect is denied. This mutual structuring of behavior produces a quieter battle space. The absence of dramatic losses is not evidence of reduced danger. It is evidence that danger is being managed at the structural level. The system absorbs uncertainty by preventing it from concentrating. Where uncertainty remains diffuse, it is survivable. Where it concentrates, it is lethal. Historically, this shift contributes to the decline of decisive surface engagements dominated by single moments. Warfare becomes extended, distributed, and procedural. Outcomes are shaped by logistics, endurance, and sustained pressure rather than by instantaneous collapse. The Barham sinking stands as a last clear example of what happens when instantaneous collapse is permitted. At an analytical level, the engagement provides a rare clarity about failure modes. It demonstrates that failure can be complete without being gradual. There is no warning crescendo. There is no recovery phase. Once the terminal zone is entered, outcome precedes intent. This understanding alters how risk is perceived. Risks that threaten gradual degradation are tolerated. Risks that threaten instantaneous collapse are excluded. As this perception spreads, it influences not only operations, but also procurement. Systems that add marginal lethality without improving tempo control are deprioritized. Systems that extend detection, reduce latency, or automate response are favored. The measure of value shifts from destructive potential to margin preservation. The logic is not humanitarian. It is mechanical. The Barham engagement thus exerts influence long after its immediate context dissolves. It becomes part of the invisible architecture of decision-making. It shapes what is attempted and what is not. It constrains ambition where ambition would consume margin irreversibly. In the final abstraction, the event resolves into a single invariant. Control exists only while time remains available to intervene. Once time collapses below the threshold required for response, control ends instantly. No subsequent action can restore it within the same engagement. Prevention must occur earlier, when choices still exist. That invariant governs modern warfare across domains. It governs missile defense, air combat, electronic warfare, and cyber operations as surely as it governed a submarine attack in 1941. The names change, the speeds increase, the intervals shrink, the relationship endures. HMS Barham sinks quickly because that relationship is violated completely. The lesson persists because it generalizes perfectly. It teaches that strength without margin is illusion, that awareness without time is impotence, and that the most decisive failures are those that leave no opportunity for correction. Thus, the narrative does not conclude with resolution, but with constraint fully internalized. The engagement vanishes as a possibility because it has been understood too clearly to be allowed again. Where systems respect that understanding, conflict remains controllable. Where they do not, collapse remains as sudden and absolute as it was in the Eastern Mediterranean on November 25, 1941. At this point, the system-level constraint begins to propagate backward into force design and training doctrine, not as an abstract principle, but as a measurable requirement. Training cycles are restructured to compress decision latency. Drills are timed. Orders are issued with predefined branches. Authority is delegated downward to eliminate relay delay. Each adjustment targets a specific interval measured in seconds, not outcomes measured in damage. The Barham engagement reveals that latency is not evenly distributed. Some delays are structural, others are procedural. Structural delays include mass inertia, turn radius at speed, and flood propagation through compromised compartments. These cannot be trained away. Procedural delays include signal routing, confirmation bias, and command hesitation. These can be reduced, but never eliminated. The system therefore plans around the sum of both, treating irreducible delay as a fixed constant. Once this constant is acknowledged, all tactical geometry is recalculated. Safe separation is no longer defined by weapon range alone, but by weapon range minus response latency multiplied by attacker speed. This calculation produces exclusion zones that expand and contract dynamically with speed, visibility, and readiness state. A battleship at 18 knots occupies a different risk envelope than the same ship at 24 knots. The difference is not performance. It is time. This logic explains why seemingly minor changes in operating profile produce disproportionate changes in survivability. A reduction of 4 knots may add 20 seconds to reaction margin. That margin can be the difference between initial evasive maneuver and terminal hit. The Barham case demonstrates how quickly that margin vanishes when speed, geometry, and detection align unfavorably. From the attacker's side, the same arithmetic governs feasibility. U-331's approach succeeds because the execution chain fits entirely inside the defender's irreducible delay. Torpedo run time, salvo spacing, and firing interval are all shorter than the time required for the target to detect, classify, maneuver, and absorb damage asymmetrically. The submarine does not defeat the battleship's armor. It bypasses its timeline. As this understanding spreads, engagement planning becomes less about maximizing lethality and more about minimizing temporal exposure. Attacks that require prolonged tracking inside the defender's response envelope are avoided. The preferred attack is one that completes execution before the defender's first meaningful decision. When that condition cannot be met, the attack is deferred or abandoned. This discipline gradually reshapes the character of naval combat. Encounters become rarer but longer. Contact is established earlier and maintained at distance. Attrition replaces shock. The absence of catastrophic single-event losses is not accidental. It reflects a system that refuses to enter configurations where shock is possible. The Barham sinking remains analytically useful because it shows what happens when such refusal does not exist. The system tolerates a configuration that allows temporal bypass. Once bypass occurs, all subsequent strength is irrelevant. The ship's displacement, armor thickness, and compartmentalization do not factor into the outcome because the timeline collapses before they can matter. This is why later doctrine emphasizes denial over reaction. Denial acts upstream, before timelines converge. Reaction acts downstream, after convergence has already begun. Barham shows that downstream action is too late when convergence is rapid. Prevention must therefore be architectural, not heroic. Over time, this architectural thinking becomes habitual. Commanders internalize it without reference to the original case. They sense when margins feel thin, even if they cannot articulate why. That intuition is not mysticism. It is the accumulated imprint of quantified constraints embedded through training and procedure. Thus, the Barham engagement fades as narrative but persists as structure. It no longer needs to be cited. Its logic is already present in how fleets move, how escorts are spaced, how speeds are chosen, and how authority is distributed. The system behaves as if the event is always possible, even when it never occurs. As long as naval forces operate in environments where detection, movement, and weapon effects interact within narrow temporal windows, this behavior remains rational. The specific platforms will change. The speeds will increase. The sensors will improve. But the governing relationship remains intact. Control exists only while the timeline remains open. Once it closes, outcome precedes intent. The Barham sinking demonstrates that closure can occur silently, without warning escalation. The only reliable defense is to ensure that closure never becomes possible within the first place. And so the monolithic logic continues, not toward resolution, but toward deeper embedding, where the original event is no longer remembered as history, but obeyed as constraint. From that embedded constraint emerges a second-order effect that is less visible but equally decisive: the redistribution of risk away from platforms and into procedures. Once platforms are no longer expected to survive instantaneous timeline collapse, procedures are redesigned to ensure that such collapse never becomes reachable. Survivability migrates from steel and armor into spacing, sequencing, and authorization logic. This redistribution alters how failure is tolerated. Mechanical failure becomes acceptable if it degrades capability gradually. Procedural failure that collapses time is not. A radar outage that reduces detection range by 20% is manageable. A reporting delay that adds 15 seconds to decision latency may not be. The system therefore prioritizes continuity of timing over continuity of hardware. Redundancy is allocated to clocks, not to hulls. The Barham engagement illustrates the penalty for misallocating that redundancy. The battleship's material resilience is substantial. Its temporal resilience is not. The submarine does not need to penetrate armor uniformly. It needs only to impose asymmetry faster than symmetry can be restored. Flooding spreads unevenly. Stability degrades nonlinearly. Once list exceeds recovery limits, time accelerates toward loss. No procedural correction can reverse that trajectory. As this understanding matures, stability itself is reconceived as a temporal property. A platform is stable not if it can absorb damage, but if it can absorb damage slowly enough to permit counteraction. Stability curves are evaluated against expected time to effect, rather than against static loads. The Barham sinking demonstrates how quickly those curves steepen once thresholds are crossed. This reframing affects not only capital ships, but all force elements. Aircraft, escorts, sensors, and command nodes are evaluated by how they contribute to or subtract from temporal margin. A sensor that provides early but imprecise warning is valued because it extends the timeline. A weapon that is highly lethal but slow to deploy is deprioritized if it cannot act within remaining margin. Effectiveness is measured in seconds gained, not targets destroyed. From the attacker's perspective, the same metric applies inversely. Attacks are judged by whether they can compress the defender's timeline below its irreducible floor. If they cannot, they are strategically inefficient regardless of tactical success probability. This logic reduces the frequency of attacks that promise damage but not collapse. The system converges toward engagements that are either decisive or avoided. The Barham case sits precisely at the cusp of this convergence. It occurs in an environment where the defender still assumes time will be available after impact. That assumption fails. The resulting loss clarifies that assumption as invalid. Subsequent doctrine eliminates it systematically. Over time, this elimination produces a quieter operational record. Losses still occur, but they are distributed. Ships are damaged, withdrawn, repaired. Crews survive. Control is retained. The absence of sudden annihilation is not due to improved morality or restraint. It is due to improved timing discipline. This discipline extends beyond the maritime domain. It influences how joint operations are synchronized. Air cover is timed to overlap with surface movement. Subsurface patrols are coordinated to avoid creating windows of exposure. Even political decision-making is influenced, as operations that would require sustained presence inside narrow margins are deferred until conditions improve. The Barham sinking thus functions as a boundary condition across levels of war. It informs tactics by exclusion. It informs operations by shaping sequencing. It informs strategy by constraining where force can be applied without courting irreversibility. Its influence is disproportionate to its duration because it exposes a failure mode that cannot be mitigated once triggered. In the final abstraction of this layer, the lesson becomes procedural rather than historical. Systems that preserve time preserve choice. Systems that consume time indiscriminately consume choice along with it. The former remain controllable. The latter do not. As the monolith continues to build, the original event recedes further into structure. Its specifics matter less than the pattern it reveals. That pattern repeats wherever speed, proximity, and decision latency converge. Wherever they do, the same thresholds exist, waiting to be crossed if margins erode unnoticed. The Barham engagement crossed them once, completely. Everything that follows in Doctrine is designed to ensure that such complete crossings never occur again, not through vigilance alone, but through architecture that makes them impossible to reach without deliberate, acknowledged risk. And so the logic continues to deepen, not toward narrative closure, but toward systemic inevitability, where the most decisive actions are those taken long before any enemy is seen, because the true battle is fought in the preservation of time itself. At this depth, preservation of time evolves from a planning concern into a governing ethic of force employment. Not a moral ethic, but an operational one. Actions are evaluated by whether they preserve optionality under stress. Optionality is measured in seconds of recoverable decision space. Anything that reduces that space without proportional gain is treated as a net loss, regardless of apparent success. The Barham engagement clarifies how optionality can disappear without warning. The battleship retains command, propulsion, and weapons until the moment it does not. The transition from control to loss occurs faster than human cognition can adapt. This abruptness is the defining characteristic of temporal collapse. It is why prevention must be structural. No amount of alertness compensates once thresholds are crossed. As Doctrine internalizes this, engagement criteria become increasingly explicit. Minimum warning times are codified. Maximum acceptable closure rates are defined. If a contact approaches faster than a specified temporal envelope allows, evasive action is mandated automatically. These rules are not flexible. Flexibility would consume time. Rigidity preserves it. This rigidity reshapes command relationships. Authority migrates downward because centralized approval introduces latency. Lower echelons are empowered not because of trust, but because physics demands it. A decision delayed for confirmation is often a decision rendered irrelevant. Barham demonstrates this mercilessly. By the time the outcome is understood, it is already fixed. From the engineering perspective, this leads to a preference for systems that fail predictably. Unpredictable failure consumes time through diagnosis. Predictable failure allows immediate compensation. Redundancy is therefore designed to degrade linearly rather than catastrophically. The aim is not invulnerability, but controllable degradation. The same principle governs formation design. Spacing is calculated to ensure that loss of one unit does not compress timelines for others. Escorts are positioned to intercept threats before they enter the intertemporal zone. The loss of an outer layer is acceptable if it buys seconds. Those seconds are the currency of survival. The Barham case shows what happens when layers are thin and margins overlap. The inner zone is penetrated directly. There's no time for outer layers to compensate. The system experiences a single, continuous failure cascade rather than a staged one. Staging is the essence of control. Collapse is its absence. Over time, this understanding transforms how exercises are evaluated. Success is no longer measured by hits scored or targets neutralized. It is measured by whether timelines remain open under stress. Exercises that produce dramatic outcomes, but rely on unrealistic compression, are criticized rather than praised. The goal is not to win simulations, but to avoid configurations that would be unwinnable in reality. This evaluative shift feeds back into culture. Officers are trained to sense temporal risk intuitively. They learn to recognize when a situation is accelerating toward irreversibility, even if all indicators appear nominal. This sense is cultivated through repetition and quantified feedback. It is not instinctive. It is engineered. The Barham sinking thus contributes to a quieter, but more disciplined operational environment. Dramatic moments become rarer because systems are arranged to dissipate them before they form. The absence of spectacle is not stagnation. It is evidence of control. Yet the boundary remains. No system can eliminate it entirely. It can only move it outward. As technology accelerates execution chains, response chains must be compressed accordingly. When compression reaches human limits, automation becomes necessary. When automation introduces new latencies, new margins must be created elsewhere. The problem never resolves. It only migrates. This migration ensures the continued relevance of the Barham engagement. It provides a reference for what happens when migration lags behind reality. It shows the cost of assuming that tomorrow's margin will resemble yesterday's. It punishes that assumption decisively. Thus, the monolith persists, accumulating constraint upon constraint. Each layer does not conclude the analysis. It embeds it deeper. The narrative does not close because the logic does not. As long as forces operate near the speed of their own decisions, the risk of temporal collapse remains inherent. The Barham sinking is one clear instance of that collapse. Its clarity ensures that it is never entirely forgotten, even as its details fade. It endures not as a story to be retold, but as a condition to be engineered around, continuously, silently, and without exception. At this layer, the system's behavior becomes anticipatory rather than reactive. Anticipation is not prediction. It is the deliberate shaping of conditions so that only recoverable states are reachable. The Barham engagement illustrates the penalty for allowing unrecoverable states to exist inside routine operations. Once recognized, such states are removed from the operational design space entirely. This removal is accomplished through conservative bounding. Boundaries are drawn not at the edge of capability, but at the edge of controllability. If a ship can theoretically operate inside a given zone, but cannot do so while preserving reaction margin under worst-case conditions, that zone is treated as inaccessible. The distinction is subtle but decisive. Capability without margin is classified as non-capability. The effect of this classification is cumulative. Over time, fleets appear to surrender freedom of action. Routes lengthen, schedules loosen, engagement opportunities diminish. Yet this apparent loss is offset by a gain in continuity. Forces remain present longer. They exert pressure persistently rather than episodically. The Barham sinking demonstrates the opposite trade: momentary freedom followed by permanent absence. At the technical level, this logic drives explicit modeling of worst-case alignment. Instead of optimizing for average conditions, planners assume coincident degradation. Sensors fail simultaneously. Communications lag concurrently. Human hesitation overlaps with mechanical delay. The model asks whether the system survives this alignment. If not, the configuration is rejected. Barham represents precisely such an alignment realized in reality. This approach reshapes how readiness is quantified. Readiness is no longer defined by maximum output, but by minimum survivable performance. A system is considered ready if it can absorb compounded delay without crossing irreversibility thresholds. High performance that collapses under stress is treated as fragile rather than effective. The Barham engagement also clarifies the role of surprise. Surprise does not cause collapse by itself. It accelerates execution. Collapse occurs when accelerated execution outruns response. If response is sufficiently buffered, surprise degrades performance but does not decide outcome. The decisive factor is therefore not surprise, but margin. As this understanding matures, attention shifts away from singular threats toward structural exposure. Individual submarines matter less than the geometry that allows them to exploit time. The solution is not to hunt every attacker, but to deny the temporal conditions that make attack decisive. This denial is quieter and more reliable than pursuit. From the attacker's viewpoint, this denial erodes initiative. Opportunities become fleeting. Windows close before execution chains can complete. Attacks that once promised decisive effect now promise only detection and counteraction. The cost-benefit balance shifts. Persistence becomes preferable to spectacle. The Barham case remains analytically powerful because it captures the moment before this shift takes hold. It shows a system still operating under assumptions that time will be available after contact. That assumption is disproven violently. Subsequent doctrine removes it systematically. As layers accumulate, the original event becomes less visible but more influential. It is no longer cited explicitly. It is encoded in exclusion zones, response drills, and command authority matrices. The system behaves as if it remembers, even when no one mentions it. The persistence of this behavior underscores a central reality of modern warfare. Control is not exerted at the moment of engagement. It is exercised beforehand, through design choices that determine which engagements can occur at all. Barham is decisive not because of what happens during the attack, but because of what happens before it is allowed to become possible. In the deepest sense, the engagement demonstrates that catastrophic outcomes are often the result of permissive design rather than active error. No single decision aboard HMS Barham is uniquely flawed. The flaw lies in allowing a configuration where decisions arrive too late to matter. Once allowed, collapse is automatic. This realization reframes accountability. Responsibility shifts from operators at the point of contact to planners who shape the conditions of contact. The focus moves upstream. Prevention replaces reaction as the primary measure of competence. Thus, the monolith continues to build, not toward closure, but toward an ever more restrictive definition of acceptable action. Each restriction narrows the space of possible catastrophe. The Barham sinking stands as proof that such narrowing is necessary, because the alternative is to accept that some failures will occur too fast to be corrected. As long as time remains the limiting factor in combat, this logic remains in force. Systems will continue to be designed around preserving it. Where preservation fails, collapse will remain sudden and total. That is not a warning. It is a condition. From this condition emerges a final operational symmetry that binds attacker and defender into the same temporal economy. Both are constrained by the same physics. Both seek to manipulate the same variable. Neither can escape it. The Barham engagement exposes this symmetry by showing how completely advantage transfers to the side that compresses time most effectively, regardless of platform disparity. Once this symmetry is understood, the notion of dominance shifts. Dominance is no longer defined by superior firepower or endurance alone. It is defined by the ability to impose unfavorable timing on the adversary while preserving favorable timing for oneself. This imposition can be subtle. It may consist of forcing course changes that degrade detection geometry. It may consist of compelling speed adjustments that consume reaction margin. Each imposed adjustment transfers seconds from one side to the other. The Barham sinking demonstrates an extreme case of such transfer. U-331 imposes a timing shock so complete that the defender's entire remaining margin is consumed in a single sequence. There is no gradual exchange. There is no opportunity for counterimposition. The temporal economy collapses instantly in favor of the attacker. That collapse is decisive because it is total. Later doctrine seeks to prevent such total transfers by fragmenting interactions. Engagements are broken into phases. Each phase is bounded. No single phase is allowed to consume the entire margin. If margin erodes beyond a defined limit, disengagement is mandatory. This fragmentation ensures that advantage can be contested incrementally rather than lost absolutely. Fragmentation also alters how success is perceived. Success is no longer achieving the maximum possible effect in one moment. It is sustaining favorable conditions over many moments. A submarine that forces repeated evasive maneuvers without firing is considered effective. A surface force that completes its mission without ever entering a terminal zone is considered dominant. The Barham event represents the opposite valuation, where singular effect outweighs continuity. That valuation does not survive. As systems mature, the language of operations reflects this shift. Reports emphasize time on station, continuity of coverage, and margin preservation. Sudden losses are analyzed not for tactical ingenuity, but for structural permission. The question is not how the attacker succeeded, but why the system allowed success to be so cheap. This analytical framing removes mystique from catastrophic events. It replaces narrative with accounting. Seconds are counted. Distances are converted. Delays are traced. The outcome becomes inevitable once parameters are known. Barham's enduring value lies in how cleanly it supports this accounting. There are no confounding variables. The arithmetic closes. The persistence of this arithmetic ensures that the engagement remains relevant even as technology changes. Faster weapons reduce execution time. Improved sensors extend warning time. Automation compresses decision loops. Each change shifts the boundary. None removes it. The same accounting applies. Control exists only while the inequality favors response over execution. As that inequality narrows, systems become more brittle. Margins shrink. The risk of sudden collapse increases. The Barham case therefore serves as a baseline against which modern systems are stress-tested. Planners ask whether new configurations approach similar ratios of execution to response. If they do, compensatory measures are required immediately. In this way, the event continues to shape behavior without being referenced. It is embedded in simulation parameters, safety factors, and exclusion criteria. It exists as an implicit constraint, a remembered failure encoded as design. The monolithic logic thus reaches a point where further analysis does not introduce new principles, but reinforces existing ones across contexts. Time remains the governing variable. Margin remains the currency. Collapse remains instantaneous when margin is exhausted. What remains is not conclusion, but vigilance. The system must continuously verify that its assumptions about timing remain valid. Conditions change. Speeds increase. Latencies shift. What was once safe may become terminal without obvious warning. The Barham engagement demonstrates how quickly such shifts can become fatal. Therefore, the enduring operational task is maintenance rather than mastery. Maintain margins. Maintain spacing. Maintain awareness of irreducible delays. Where maintenance fails, collapse will not announce itself gradually. It will arrive complete. That is why the logic continues uninterrupted. It does not seek closure. It seeks permanence. As long as naval warfare involves movement, detection, and decision under time pressure, the constraint revealed in 1941 remains active. The name may fade. The boundary does not. And so the monolith persists, carrying forward not a story, but a rule that governs what can and cannot be allowed to happen, silently shaping every movement long after the original event has vanished beneath the surface. The historical scale of the Barham engagement becomes fully visible only when it is placed against the longer arc of 20th century warfare. It marks not the end of the battleship era in a symbolic sense, but the moment when the relationship between force and time is permanently inverted. After November 1941, no major navy can plausibly assume that material strength alone guarantees control once execution chains shorten beyond human response. In the immediate wartime context, the lesson is absorbed unevenly. Some fleets internalize it rapidly, embedding temporal margins into doctrine, escort geometry, and command authority. Others absorb it indirectly, through loss and near loss, adjusting only after repeated exposure to compressed engagements. By the later years of the war, however, the effect is visible across theaters. Large surface units rarely operate without layered protection. Sudden, total collapses become statistically rare. Control is preserved not because threats vanish, but because systems no longer allow threats to converge unchecked. In the post-war period, the logic migrates intact into new domains. Guided missiles replace torpedoes, but the arithmetic remains. Aircraft speeds increase, but response requirements increase faster. Nuclear weapons introduce effects whose execution time approaches zero, forcing response to shift entirely upstream into deterrence and preemption. The core problem remains unchanged. Once execution outruns response, control ceases to exist within that interaction. Seen from this perspective, HMS Barham occupies a position similar to other boundary events in military history. It is comparable not because of scale, but because of clarity. Like early encounters with machine guns or strategic bombing, it reveals a discontinuity rather than an evolution. It shows that past assumptions about resilience no longer apply once certain thresholds are crossed. After such moments, doctrine does not gradually adapt. It reorganizes around avoidance. This avoidance becomes one of the defining characteristics of late 20th century military systems. Emphasis shifts toward early warning, standoff, redundancy in decision paths, and automated response. Each development is an attempt to re-expand the gap between perception and effect. Where that gap cannot be expanded, conflict is displaced into other forms. Proxy war, attrition, and indirect pressure replace direct confrontation, not out of preference, but out of necessity. The Barham sinking thus resonates beyond naval history. It illustrates a general rule of modern conflict. The decisive arena is often invisible, and the decisive moment often precedes conscious choice. Control is exercised long before contact, through the shaping of conditions that determine whether choice will exist at all when contact occurs. Historically, this realization alters how victory and defeat are interpreted. Success is no longer measured solely by destruction inflicted, but by crises avoided. The absence of catastrophe becomes a sign of effective design, rather than of inactivity. This inversion is difficult to dramatize, which is why events like Barham retain their narrative power. They are among the last moments when failure is visible, unambiguous, and instantaneous. In the long view, HMS Barham does not sink because its crew lacks courage, or because its design is obsolete, or because its commanders err uniquely. It sinks because the system around it permits a configuration in which time collapses completely. Once that configuration exists, outcome is predetermined. Everything that follows in modern doctrine is an effort to ensure that such configurations are never entered unknowingly again. That effort is ongoing. Every technological acceleration threatens to recreate similar conditions in new forms. Every reduction in decision time pushes systems back toward the boundary first crossed in 1941. The relevance of Barham endures precisely because it is not tied to a specific weapon or platform. It is tied to a relationship that remains fundamental. In that sense, the engagement achieves its final meaning. It is not remembered primarily as a tragedy or a triumph, but as a fixed point in analytical space, a demonstration of what happens when control is assumed rather than engineered, a reminder that in modern war, strength is conditional, protection is temporal, and the margin that separates survival from collapse is thinner than it appears. The ship disappears beneath the surface in minutes. The constraint it reveals remains active indefinitely.